Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hospitality Edge podcast. This podcast is meant to bring together what we think are two sides of the same coin, real estate and hospitality. Whether you are a current or aspiring short-term rental property manager, host, or real estate investor, you're in the right place. Dive in with us to uncover the captivating stories and golden nuggets from industry heavyweights, including leaders, operators, investors, syndicators, founders, and entrepreneurs. So thank you. Really, thank you for embarking on this journey with me. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this podcast, and I promise I'll do my best to deliver value-packed episodes that hopefully will not just inform, but also help inspire the next generation of real estate and hospitality professionals. Truly yours, Sebastián Muñoz. Welcome, everyone, to the Hospitality Edge podcast, where we bring together what we think are two sides of the same coin, real estate and hospitality. Today, I'm very excited to have with us Sabrina Calnan, founder of B&B Excellent. She's also an Airbnb ambassador, superhost, coach, educator, serial entrepreneur, property manager. The list goes on and on. Super excited to have you on, Sabrina. Thank you for taking the time. And for anyone that's not, familiar with your background, would you mind just telling us a little bit about what you've been up to these days?
Sure. Yeah. Well, these days I'm up to everything related to short-term rentals and Airbnb. It truly is my passion, and I love helping people become successful Airbnb investors. I have been involved in Airbnb since 2014, and I've really got involved because at that time I was working I had a long-term property management firm and I was getting a ton of questions from people about Airbnb. And I thought, let me be a resource to my clients. Let me learn about this business.
Mhm.
And so I started hosting one of my own properties. I took on a few Airbnb properties to co host, and I saw just a real need in the market. And I saw that there was an art and a science to this. And I've
Mhm.
seen the market evolve since 2015. Now we're going into a more mature market, and the way you handle that is very different than the way it was handled in the very beginning. So um my passion is helping people be successful with that.
That's awesome. That's awesome, Sabrina. I wanna dive a little bit into your story and how you got started. You bought your first property, your first investment property at 23 years old.
Yeah.
Uh, how did you first get interested in real estate? I mean, at 23 years old, you were quite young.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Yeah, I always like to joke that that was my quarter life crisis. Right out of college, I was working at an investment bank. Investment banking, as many of you know, is a really hard business to be in. I was leaving my home at 5 a.m. in the morning. I was getting home at 11:30 at night. That was completely normal. That's completely expected.
Hmm.
And, I had a little bit of burnout from that. And I'd always thought in the back of my mind, I'm not going to make my money off of my career, my trained career. I'll make my money off of my investments. So
Hmm.
after 9/11, I actually was let go from that job. And I took a moment to just reassess myself and reassess my life. And
Hmm.
I was 23. I was, not tied down. I had a good amount of savings, and I actually went to the Bahamas for a month. I got certified to teach yoga. And while I was there, I was like, well, yoga's not going to make a full time living for me. Let me learn about real estate. And so I was there. We slept in a tent every single night. We were outside the whole time. At night, after yoga was over, I was in my tent reading my real estate books. And so, I came back from that training and I dove full in. Uh, at 23, this was around, I think it was 2002 ish at that time. Um, and as many people are aware, at that time, the launch standards were very loose. And so, if you had good credit, they didn't really verify your income or anything along those lines. You got a loan. And that's what I was able to do. I was able to get a home loan to purchase my first investment property. I purchased it before I'd ever owned a home myself. I had negotiated a deal with a seller who he had the motivation to leave because he was making a lifestyle change. He was actually moving out of the country and wanted to let go of his house. And we had negotiated a deal where I got quite a bit of cash back at closing. And then I rented that property out on a rent to own basis. And
Interesting.
yeah, yeah, and it's rent to own is not a it's not a technique that many people see these days, you know. I think it's coming back a little bit. A lot of investors are now talking about the subject to loans
Okay.
or the subject to purchases, which are coming back because interest rates are so high compared to what they used to be. And you know, if you want me to delve into
Yeah.
some.
What are the difference between the rent to own and the subject to, just for those out there that are not familiar?
Yeah, yeah. So rent to own is where, as an investor, if you are wanting to purchase a property, you can find someone who's willing to rent to own. So you usually put a larger down payment down.
Hmm.
You negotiate essentially a strike price. Like after 3 years, you'll purchase the property at X number of dollars. The expectation is that you would have quite a bit of equity after 3 years.
Hmm.
But it's a
But there's
technique
no
that
guarantee, right? There's no guarantee
there's
that they actually
there's no
go through.
guarantee, and you don't actually have to buy the property. And in fact, the investor who's selling you the property on the rent to own basis probably doesn't really care if you buy it or not.
Hmm.
Um, but it's a technique that's used for people who have bad credit, who want to purchase a property oftentimes, because the idea is that you solidify the rent to own contract at a set price. You take that 2 to 3 years to improve your credit score, and then when the contract comes due, you can buy that property. You can qualify for a loan and buy that property. And so what I was is I just decided to be on the other side of that transaction because I was able to purchase a property and I had good credit. And so I rented this one out on a rent to own basis. And I was actually very, very naive at 23. The first tenant I put in there, I put in there very quickly. I actually didn't take a security deposit on them. And didn't do a background check, didn't do anything. They were a large family. They lived in the home for a couple of years, moved out. I got very lucky. They left the home in fine condition. We cleaned it up and I re-rented it a couple of years later. And that's when I'd gotten a little bit smarter. I did the rent to own at that time. I took a large deposit that would turn into a down payment should my renter purchase this property. I did a background check, but I didn't understand how to read that background check. So there were some red flags in that background
Mm.
check that I should have noticed. Um, and he moved in and he lived there for about a year without issues. And then in the second year, he started having trouble paying the rent. It took a while to get him evicted and out of the property. Once he was out of the property, it had been completely destroyed. Because the property was a rent to own, um, I thought I was being so smart. I was like, "Oh, well, he's going to become the owner of this property. He's responsible for the maintenance on this property." Well, if you don't actually own a property, you have no incentive to maintain a
Mm.
property. Why would you spend your own money to maintain a property that you don't own? I was also very naive in thinking that, "Oh, he's buying it rent to own. He's going to take care of the property. I don't need to check up on this property."
Mhm.
Once again, big rookie landlord mistake. You know, you need to keep an eye on your properties because even the best renter has maintenance that needs to happen. It's just a part of owning a property. You've got to clean those gutters. You've got to, make sure the paint looks good. You've got to service the furnace, change those furnace filters, little things like that that really wear and tear on your property. And I was just so naive, having never owned a property and being only 23 years old, I had no idea. So I came out of that property uh, after that renter moved out. I was in pretty poor shape. I was super stressed out. I had to borrow some money from my parents to rehab it and get it going. And at that time, it was 2008. It was the very beginning of 2008, and I was working in mortgage-backed securities.
You
And
went back to work, right? Because
yes,
you had thought that, investment banking was done for you, and you were going to be able to now be a full-time real estate investor, and now you realize, oh my god, I'm going to have to go back and actually find a job. So how
yeah.
was that decision of you realizing, I'm not maybe ready just yet to do this full time, I need to take a step back and go and actually find a job in the meantime? Was that hard for you to make, or was it just like the clearest next move at that point given the circumstances?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question, and that was a real time of change in my life. So, um, I basically what happened is I got married, I bought a house, I moved, and I started a new job all within 2 weeks. And so,
Wow.
these decisions came as we were engaged, we were getting ready to get married. Both my husband and I are entrepreneurs, we always have been. And we were young and we were at a point where I was like, "You know what? I kinda need to get it together a little bit more. I've gained a ton of knowledge, but I'm not earning the income that I need to earn." My husband is an entrepreneur, you know, his income is unstable, and I thought, maybe I'm ready. I'm ready to go back. And I started searching for a company that would be a good fit for my skills. And I found a company here in the Denver area where they evaluated mortgage backed securities. And I was like, this is perfect. This combines my skills in investment banking along with my skills in real estate. And, I interviewed there. Uh, I interviewed for just a starter analyst position because at that point in time I was essentially starting over. But
Mhm.
I had so much experience and so many contacts that they hired me as an analyst, but they made me sign all sorts of NDAs and non-compete agreements, which is very uncommon for someone in that starting level because
Mm.
I had been so much in the industry and, I was going to have all of this inside information on real estate and, whose loans were going bad and the values of properties that, they didn't want me taking that proprietary knowledge and using it out in the world. So I was, very committed to holding my end of the bargain. And I worked at that job for 8 years.
Wow.
I worked myself up in that company to where I was managing our commercial banking department and I was managing bank loan mergers and acquisitions when I finally left that job in 2013 before I started my property management firm. But
Wow.
yeah, I started in
Interesting.
mortgage-backed securities in 2005, and so I saw the run up, and then I saw the very beginning of what was happening when we started seeing losses come in on, the lower tiers of these mortgage-backed securities. We
Yeah.
started seeing homes losing value, and in 2008 was exact time my renter had, been evicted and the house was destroyed and I was rehabbing it, and I thought to myself, I'm so lucky to have this knowledge. Now is the time for me to sell this property before the bottom drops out of the market. I put it on the market. I was able to sell it before everything hit in 2008. And so I
So
got
I
quite
want to I
lucky.
want to touch on that for a second because you have a very unique perspective, because you were, an insider, in
Yeah.
terms of what was going on, those triple A loans that were not really triple A, and
Right.
whatnot, and then the rest is history. But you were able to see those red flags early enough to that you were able to sell that property, and I think you mentioned in another podcast that you broke even,
Yeah.
where if you had waited maybe a couple of months or whatnot, you probably would have lost a lot of money,
Yeah.
like a lot of people did.
Yeah.
So what are some of those red flags that you were able to identify? Do you think you could have identified them without being an insider? And what are some lessons that you would now say to someone that's looking at the state of the economy and at what's going on when you should make those kind of decisions to say, I think like something's coming up here.
Yeah.
I'll liquidate. I'll sell before it's too late.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good question. So some of the red flags I saw, being on the inside of things is part of what we would do is, for every loan, for every property that was sold out of foreclosure, we would evaluate to see if the bank had done a good job with that. So, did the bank, little things, did the bank offer that person a payment plan? Um, they're supposed to do that, uh, you know, and if they did offer the payment plan and they did eventually go to foreclosure, did the bank sell this property at a fair value? And so we were constantly looking at comparables on these foreclosure sales to see. And what I was starting to see was that properties were selling at lower and lower values, and they were selling at more and higher losses.
Mm.
And so, that's something I sort of saw on the inside, but it's certainly something that you can catch now and I pay attention to, not being on the inside like that. I'm constantly watching property listings in the MLS. And you don't have to be, you don't have to have access to the MLS to do this, but just watch the listings, see, how long they hang there on the market. Are
Mhm.
prices being reduced? And we are seeing a lot of that right now. And I do not think we're in a 2008 situation by any means. The housing supply is very different than it was in 2008. We have a shortage in housing supply, whereas in 2008 we had a huge oversupply and a ton of new builds. Also, work with your local real estate agents. So many of them, part of their business is putting out statistics on the market. Work with your local real estate agents. That information is free. A lot of them post it on social media. Just pay attention to the market. And that's kind of how you get that feel for
Mhm.
things. And
Yeah, no, that's great. And before we go into what came next, which was the property management business,
uh
I wanna understand. So the mechanics, right? Because you're saying we're not in 2008 because there's a supply. There's not enough supply right now, whereas in 2008 there was oversupply, right?
yeah,
What
yeah.
else is different that makes it so that people shouldn't panic right now because it's not the same as in 2008? What else do you see
Yeah.
differently, and maybe what are some of the similarities, which is where people get scared and think, oh, it is like 2008? What would you tell those people?
Yeah, so I think the big difference is people have a lot more equity in their home than they did back in 2008, because number one, they have such a low supply of properties in the market. Number two, the loan standards were completely revamped after 2008. They tightened that up. They were giving on home equity lines back then, they were giving like 110% of the value. They don't do that anymore. Anything more than 80% is almost unheard of loan to
Hmm.
value in what is provided by the lenders these days. So I think, the homeowners that we have in the market are much less likely to over leverage themselves
Hmm.
than homeowners we had in the market in 2008.
Hmm.
So, it does seem that we are starting to see the foreclosures tick up a little bit. It seems to be mainly, in the institutional realm, which is, your big institutional investors that own tons and tons of properties. You don't see the homeowner individuals going into foreclosure as much as we were seeing in 2008. And when the properties do go into foreclosure, they resell it at a significantly higher value because there's
Okay.
equity in there. So we're not seeing the same market climate that we had in 2008. The market has also changed in the fact that we're not seeing as many new builds come into the market as we were in 2008, which is part of the reason we have, such a shortage in the housing supply. But the thing about new builds, and I think this is probably an unpopular opinion that I have,
Hmm.
but new build properties are a lot like new cars. So when it's a brand new property and it's new and you purchase it, it's awesome. But as soon as the neighborhood next door starts making new properties, or even in
Hmm.
the same neighborhood, a new build comes up, if you need to go sell that property when there are new builds all around you, all of a sudden no one's interested in yours because yours is lived in for a year or 2 years and they can buy a brand new property
Hmm.
the same price. or slightly more. And so you have to reduce the price. So, for the first couple of years, a new build loses value. And that's one of the things that we saw in 2008. There was so many new builds, and those new builds oftentimes were the ones going into foreclosure because the builders were offering these insane, you know, low underwriting standards and letting anybody who had a pulse get a loan, and maybe
Yeah.
these people shouldn't have gotten loans. So
Interesting.
yeah,
That's interesting, and it's good news, I guess, for investors out there that are stressed. It's opportunities, of course, that come as some property owners are no longer able to make their payments. There's opportunities for investors in coming in at those points, but it's good to know that it's not at this scale as it was in 2008. I want to we'll come back to your investment strategies and lessons when it comes to that. But
yeah,
you basically realized after working with mortgage backed securities that you missed the excitement. You had that entrepreneurial fire inside of
yeah,
you,
yeah.
and so you decided, you saw an opportunity in property management, long-term property management, and then you went on and built a quite large operation relatively fast. So tell us about how that happened, and how you went from this idea to selling the business a couple of years later.
Yeah. So that story is interesting. So, I had sort of worked myself back into that investment banking realm, which again, the lifestyle that goes with investment banking isn't really a lifestyle that allows you for a lot of balance or family time or anything like that. And I got to the point where I knew that wasn't the lifestyle I wanted. I had been married for, at that point in time, 8 years. I was getting ready to have children and things like that. I knew I needed a huge change in my life. Um, and so, I kind of just started thinking about it. I started talking to other entrepreneurs. And at that point in time, my husband and I had purchased the home that we live in now. And we were planning to hold on to our previous home and rent it out. And I had a really hard time finding a property manager that I felt comfortable with. A lot of them, I'd even called and I just asked, like, hey, would you be willing to advise me on what I need to do to make this a good rental property? Um, a lot of them weren't even willing to give me the time of day to meet me if
Hmm.
they didn't know for sure that I was going to sign with them. And I ended up self-managing that property because I couldn't find a good place in that, just a good service in that market. And I thought there's room for a good property manager out here. And so through my networking and talking to other entrepreneurs, I actually had connected with the owner of a manufacturing company, plastics manufacturing. And he was a great guy. He saw a lot of potential in me. And he just said, hey, when you start a business, give me a call. I want to partner with you. And so that's exactly what I did. He helped to fund the startup of my property management business. I'm ever grateful to him. And then ultimately, what happened is he realized that property management has nothing to do with his current business. And there was just not a lot of synergies there. Um,
Much liability.
yes, yes. And a lot of liability. And it made him a little bit nervous. And like I said, he was a man true to his word. I'm forever grateful to him. And he said to me, you know what? I need to separate myself from this business, but you take this and you run with it. You owe me nothing at all. And so, that's what I did. And I built the business quickly through relationships and really becoming an expert in my market. Everywhere I went, I I decided to, see what I can do to become a resource to real estate agents in the area. Because if I
Hmm.
could be a trusted resource to them, you know, they I could help them in their business. They could refer their clients over to me. And
Hmm.
nobody has more clients to refer to property management than a real estate agent.
Hmm.
And so, I with with the firm that I joined, I decided, at every team meeting, let me give a little bit of information about how rentals work, about real estate, about the rental market. Eventually, I started teaching classes. Like I said, this is how I got into becoming involved in Airbnb. Is then people were starting to ask me about Airbnb because I saw that I was a knowledgeable expert that was willing to help. And I started giving Airbnb 101 webinars to real estate agents because I saw that there was a lot of misinformation in the market. People were making bad investment decisions. People were not checking rules and regulations first. And people were getting into the market before they did their research. They were getting ill advised from real estate agents. Um, and I wanted to be there to help prevent any of that and help people make wise choices. And that's really how I built my business was, I put myself out there to be a resource to people, and
That's
once they're
awesome.
a trusted resource, you know
Education is
more.
the best way to deliver value and eventually grow from that. But I'm curious to know that transition from long-term rentals to
Mm.
short-term rentals, Airbnb. How did that happen? um, because at first the property management company that you're talking about, it was long-term rental
Yes,
focus,
yeah,
right?
it was long-term
How did you
rental.
get into Airbnb then?
Yeah, so, like I said, I started the business in long-term rentals. I was getting questions about Airbnb. Uh, so I started taking on some short-term rental clients that were renting their homes out furnished monthly. And
Okay.
then, I'm lucky enough to have a little carriage house on the back of my house that was rented out long term at the time. We'd had a renter who had been there since before we purchased the property, and that property was it was just itching for a remodel. And for some reason, I was like itching for a real estate project, and I was
Hmm.
like, "All right, it's time to remodel this carriage house back here. Let me remodel it. Let me make it really nice, and let me try this out." As not just a 30-day furnished rental, but let me try this out as this newfangled Airbnb thing.
Hmm.
And I'm not the type of person who just jumps into something without research.
Hmm.
I quite nerdy. I did a lot of research on understanding like what makes the most successful Airbnb property. How do these Airbnb search algorithms work? How do I be a great host? Because I knew that was the absolute key. Because this is the misnomer I think about investing in short-term rentals is it's not a real estate business. It's a real estate business and a hospitality business, which is
Hmm.
why I think, your podcast is such an enlightening podcast for a lot of people because it shows that cross between the two.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's how I got into it. And I really fell in love with it. I just thought it was a lot more fun because, you have this creative component to things where you're decorating properties, you're making them look nice, you're making them comfortable. You're working with people who are excited to be in your area. You have a chance to make people feel happy and comfortable. Whereas in the long-term business, you do that, but you start out from a much different base. You're collecting a security deposit. The
Hmm.
first thing you're asking tenants to do is to go in and tell you everything that's wrong with the property so they don't get charged when they move out.
Yeah.
And your only interaction with that tenant and with the property owner is really when something's not going the way it should. There's a, there's something that needs to be maintained in the property or the tenant is doing something.
Hmm. Yeah, and there's
Yeah.
also this misconception that I find interesting of people that are doing long-term rentals where they think it's safer, but the argument for short-term rentals is, well, at least on the short-term rentals you get to see your properties more often. You
Yeah.
rent long-term, you rent it, and yes, you could have done your due diligence, your background checks, but at the end of the day, most of the times you don't see that property again until they leave, or if
Absolutely.
something
Yeah.
goes wrong, and then sometimes there's big surprises, which at least on the short-term rental side there's rotation for you to always keep a pulse on and a look on how things are going.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing I really loved about doing the short-term rentals is that you don't have furniture moving in and out. You get your eyes on that property constantly. And then also with the short-term rental, your average stay is 3 or 4 days. So someone comes in, they clean that property from top to bottom
That's
every
right.
3 to 4 days. And what I learned is that so much wear and tear on a home comes from just the living, using, and, cleaning it not as often as you clean a
Sure.
short rental.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Now, it takes a lot of courage and self-awareness to do what you did next, which is you built this company for what, 6 years, and you
Right.
grew to 100 properties or so under management. But then
Yeah.
you realize that, hey, if I really want to build the lifestyle that I want, I would have to double or triple the size of this business.
Yeah.
And you ask yourself some important questions at that point, which led to the to the sale, to the liquidation of the business. Talk to us about that process of starting to realize that this thing you had been working on for 6 years maybe was no longer the right opportunity vehicle for you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I think a great property manager is a property manager. I always like to call a, you know, refer to a term that I call real estate robot. They keep the emotions out of it. They do the same process for every property, for every person, for every homeowner. That is the way that you scale a long-term property management company and you scale it successfully. Um, and for me, my personality is just a much more hands-on type personality. So, I was more of a boutique firm. I enjoyed catering and meeting my owners where they needed to be. Of course, with regards to like rental standards and background checks and things like that, very much I was a real estate robot because you have to be in order to do things legally according to fair housing and things like that. But I also at the same time I very much cared about my tenants and if something bad happened in a property, it really hit me hard, like in my heart. Like I the thought of some of the liability that comes along with, being a long-term property management company, just, even though maybe legally I wouldn't be a lot liable, I felt really terrible, or I felt really guilty if something went wrong. So, for example, and this was a big turning point for me, at 100 properties, of course, I had outside help. I had, um, an outsourced company that was doing emergency calls, handling emergency maintenance, and things like that for me. And we had some tenants that were in a property, um, a nice young couple, pregnant. Their carbon monoxide detectors started going off. And my third party servicer just did not handle it well. And I
Mm.
happened to be online late at night. I happened to see it come through. I happened to see that they didn't take it seriously, and I don't understand why, but if a carbon monoxide detector is going off, it's could be deadly. Uh, and so, I at that point I realized like there's no hands off in this
Mhm.
business. Like you have to be there, you have to care, or you have to have someone who's cares just as much as you do, which is hard to hire that person until you scale to 2 to 3 times the size that I was, because you're not profitable if you have a high level, highly paid person who's just overseeing all of that. And, at that point in time, I stepped in, I got those people out of the property, I got them into a hotel, we repaired the property, found them someplace else to stay, all of that. But it just hit me really hard. Like, what if I hadn't been online at night and the they the tenants, for whatever reason, did not leave the property. They weren't advised to leave the property. They didn't leave the property on their own. I had to tell them, like, "Get out of there. I want you to be safe. We will pay for your hotel." But I think if they hadn't had that reassurance that they would be paid for and taken care of, they maybe didn't have the means or just didn't, they didn't leave. And so, that was a big turning point for me. And once you're involved like that, there's no boundary to your time. It could be your, it happened to me, I was celebrating my daughter's birthday at her birthday party. We were singing happy birthday and I was dealing with an emergency, with a furnace at a property.
Mhm.
But you know what? I'm not your real estate robot that I need to be in order to scale this and make it a really profitable business.
Mhm.
But I have an incredible portfolio because I was very particular about the properties and the homeowners that I brought on. And many times I'd be at conferences and I'd be talking to other property managers and, me with my investment banking background, I saw that there was a big consolidation happening in the property management industry. I saw that the market was quite frothy. And I said, this is a good time for me to sell and get a lot of money for this business that I built. Whereas if I hang out and I wait, maybe I won't be able to do that.
Did you go through a broker for that? Did you just go and meet with people in your network, or how did
I
that
decided
happen?
I decided to go through a business broker.
Okay.
And I feel like that is a big part of the reason that I got a nice value and a nice contract for the sale of my company. For me, it was uh, uh, sold for cash. My
Hmm.
friends were completely out of it because I sold to a property manager that was well established. Whereas a lot of times, when you negotiate the sale of a property management company, they have what they call clawbacks, where you sell, but if you're the manager that purchases your company loses a certain amount of business within the first year, you then, owe them money or they,
Right. Or there's an earn out, where you need to stay with the company for a little while.
yeah,
Uh, so to make sure that the transition goes well. Well, congrats. Good to know that went well, and you were able to sell. Now, you went on to build a property management business, but
mhm,
focused on Airbnb, property management, short-term rentals. And I'm just curious because what you were describing earlier about, you know, when you're too small to afford the level of seniority that you would need to
uh-huh,
really be hands off. I think that's a challenge that both long-term and short-term rental property managers face. So
absolutely, yeah,
having gone through that experience of getting to that size on the long-term property management, and then realizing it would take 2 to 3 times that size to afford that kind of talent,
mhm.
what did you do differently when building the short-term rental property management portfolio to ensure that it matched your your lifestyle goals and whatnot?
Yeah, so I really took a hard look at the things that, that I didn't enjoy in the long-term property management and the things that took a lot of time, the things that cut into my bottom line quite a lot. And so when I built the co-hosting service, um, I made sure that I built the service where I really could add a lot of value with my expertise and my ability to create systems and my ability to automate things. But at the same time, I do partner with my homeowners because there's a lot that I don't do for my homeowners. I don't do any sort of accounting or financial reporting, which is a big part of your traditional full service property management, either long term or short term.
Hmm.
Uh, my homeowners do have their hands in their own properties. They're ultimately responsible for the condition and maintenance of that property.
Okay.
I'm there. I'm reporting back. I of course am very aware of what's happening at the property, but ultimately, that homeowner is responsible for doing that regular maintenance. Let's make sure the
Okay.
front door gets changed, the gutters get cleaned, all those little things. Um, and so, those are the pieces of things that uh,
Interesting.
that I didn't enjoy. And then I partnered with a cleaning and a maintenance company so that,
Hmm.
my homeowners would have that resource that they needed to sort of piece together everything they needed to run a successful property management company.
Hmm.
Run a successful Airbnb.
Yeah.
And, my expertise, because I have such a background in finance and real estate and investment banking, I feel like the biggest value add that I provide to my clients is what I do on the back end for my clients,
Mm.
which is really working on that revenue strategy, working on that listing optimization, and constantly working on that. I feel like, and I know that you guys know this because you also put a big emphasis on this. I think that's a piece of things that back end piece is what a lot of people are missing about being successful in the market. You only hear about like make your property look beautiful, put in, a mini golf course in the backyard, add all of these special amenities to make your property stand out. But the truth is, be a great host, be a caring host. And then if you work on the back end, that's really the secret sauce to being a successful Airbnb host and standing out above the rest.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about, revenue management, which is, a big part of what you're describing here, as far as the back end goes. How did you teach yourself revenue management, and what are some things that you know now about revenue management that when you look at, how most people handle their pricing, you think they're doing, not the right way?
Yeah. So I think a lot of people think that revenue management and Airbnb general is a set it and forget it. You choose your price range, you throw it into your either into smart pricing or into your into your pricing software, Price Labs, Wheelhouse, whatever, and you let the software do its thing. What I have learned is that letting the software do its thing is the first step. But
Hmm.
at the same time, revenue management is a little bit of an art. It's a little bit of a science, a little bit of innate intuitive understanding of the real estate market, which, of course, that's something I've been involved in for years and years and years. And so, really understanding those market supply and demand cycles and understanding what's happening in your market, you should be adjusting your base price regularly
Hmm.
and even your high and your low prices, and I don't like to put a high price limit on most of my properties. I let the software do that, but, adjusting your low price also needs to happen during certain different times of the year, depending on
Hmm.
what's happening in the market, depending on the demand in your area, depending on how many, people have started new Airbnbs in your neighborhood. Um,
Hmm.
this is a big thing that people are talking about, the Airbnb bust, the market saturation. It's something to be addressed. And, I think just because there's market saturation in your area doesn't mean you can't be a successful Airbnb host. You absolutely can. And all of our properties are still doing well. Uh, it's a matter of really working that revenue strategy more than,
Hmm. And
uh,
not letting it run itself. I think it's
yeah,
crucial. We always say that there's planes, which are the tools that are out there. There's market data tools, there's dynamic pricing tools, whatnot. But every plane needs a pilot, like
yeah,
yourself
yeah,
or like a specialist that is gonna, actually take the time to make the most out of those tools. And that's what I think a lot of people underestimate, as far as how many pilots are actually going to be needed. So no, I think that's great. Now, just curious though, so you built, BNB excellence, and it has, the property management side, but it also has, the e-learning, e-education consulting side
yeah.
of things. So how are you currently managing between both, between, education, consulting, and property management, and how did that, other vertical come about?
Yeah. So right now, I'm co-hosting about 30 properties. I do that essentially on my own with my cleaning and my maintenance partner that I use. But I have everything down to just such a tight process. And I utilize different softwares. People are always talking about their tech stack. Hospitable is a big part of my process, because through them I can automate my guest reviews, my guest communications, as well as all of my scheduling. I use Price Labs as part of my tech stack. I like to use AirDNA. I'm learning a little bit more about key data, which is also excellent. Uh, and so, I have a tech stack that allows me to be very efficient with my properties. The other way that I'm able to be very efficient with my properties, and I recommend this for any co-host or property manager who's getting started out, is be very intentional about the type of property that you bring on and the type of homeowner that you bring on, because I was very consistent in the type of property that I brought on. So
Hmm.
each has a very similar process, whereas as if you are, if you have one property by the beach and you have one property down, in town and you have another property that's a ski chalet, all of
Hmm.
those are handled and managed very differently. And so I've been very consistent with my property type, which
Hmm.
allows me to be very, very efficient. So, because I've done that, I've really learned, but I've really streamlined this process, with the properties that I co-host, it doesn't take a lot of time. And as has sort of come up in my career throughout time, I've just really enjoy teaching and coaching and mentoring. And I take what I've learned, over all of these years and all of this innate experience that I've gained, and I do my best to pass that on to my mentees and the people that I work with so that they can take that knowledge without having to learn it over 20 years and apply that to their own investments.
That's awesome.
So, that's really where I'm making a shift to focusing my time is really working with people to teach them how to be successful short-term rental investors, successful real estate investors, and then, a big part of my services that I offer to the people that I work with, because a lot of people love short-term rental as a lifestyle business. They stay in their properties sometimes. They love dealing with guests. They love the design side of things. I like to call that the front end of short-term rental, but they don't like that back end. Numbers are much less interesting. They're much less exciting. They're much less interactive, and just putting your nose into data and a spreadsheet isn't fun for a lot of people. So I'm there to support them on the back end with that.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So let's talk a little bit about those principles or lessons that you're now passing on to others. People that might be already active real estate investors,
Sure.
but are looking to put some of their portfolio units as short-term rental units, or even just new investors that want to get into this space. Um, so first, underwriting. When it comes to underwriting short-term rentals, uh, specifically versus traditional, whether it's multifamily or single family, what would you say are some of the most important do's and don'ts when it comes to underwriting?
Yeah. So I think one of the most important do's with underwriting, especially on short term rentals, is to understand that it's very unpredictable in a lot of ways, and the market changes very quickly. And, COVID really demonstrated that for us. All of a sudden, COVID hit, bookings went down by 80%. People ran, they got out of the market, they converted their properties to long term rentals, they sold them. But then, like 2 months later, short-term rental, Airbnb, travel, it came back with a vengeance, and there were record years, 2021, 2022.
Oh yeah.
And, now we're returning to somewhat of a more normal market, but it does fluctuate quite a lot with supply and demand. So that's a big thing. Supply increases and decreases very quickly with regards to short-term rentals because it's easy to get in and it's easy to get out of that market. So I think that's a big do. The other do is to really know yourself. Are you that type of person who's okay with an up and down? I always say real estate is a long game. Look at your revenue over an annual basis, not a monthly basis.
Yeah.
That's the biggest mistakes that I see investors making. They always say, how much can I make per day? Or how much can I make per month?
Oh
What
yeah.
would I expect to make? And it will literally change every month. So if you're that person who is going to get really nervous when it's the low season and your property makes one third of what it made in the high
Hmm.
season, short-term rental might not be for you.
Hmm.
The other do is to get to know and get involved in your market. What are the regulations? How well established are they? What's the political climate? Does it look like they might tighten short-term rental regulations? And that is the direction that most regulations are going in,
Hmm.
tightening versus like loosening up. Although it's very curious, I'm curious to see what happens in this market as climate change affects people more and more. We saw Hawaii with everything that happened in Lahaina, um, in the Big Island of Hawaii, they loosened up their short-term rental restrictions to allow for housing for the people who had lost their homes in Lahaina.
Hmm.
So I would be curious to see as we see, more hurricanes, more city wildfires, how do these regulations become effective? Do they change them temporarily to allow to support for the housing of displaced people? Um, so it's just some really pay attention to your market and regulations.
Yeah,
Check
that's so important.
check your HOA. I can't tell you how many people have purchased a property without understanding what their HOA rules were and then not being able to short-term rent after some time. That happens all the time, and sometimes even if you check with your HOA and it's okay, the HOA and the HOA board decides to change their mind. So just know that things can change, and when you underwrite a property, make sure you underwrite it with a backup plan. Does this work for me as a long-term rental?
Yes.
Will I be able to make improvements to this property and sell it at a profit if I decide that I need to sell it? Just have a backup plan with regards to short-term rental.
Very, very good points. And I'm glad you covered at the end the one about if it doesn't cash flow as a long-term, rental property, at least to have that as a second option, then, you know, be careful. But it's hard sometimes nowadays to find, at least where I am based in Montreal, properties that cash flow long-term,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's where, short-term rentals becomes an interesting option. But then again, you're depending on the fact that regulations will remain what they are, demand will remain what it is, and we know that it's not always the case. So definitely, I think stress testing your assumptions both on the revenue side of things and on the expenses side of things as much as possible are good pieces of advice. uh, Before we go on to other things there that I have questions for you about, have you kept buying property yourself, since the time where you had to sell that property,
Yeah.
investment property as well? And how has your real estate investing career evolved?
Yeah. So, after I sold that the property in 2008, I took a little break, but not because I wanted to, but because I didn't necessarily have the means to
Hmm.
purchase another property for a little while. And I was just so disappointed because I was like, this is such an opportunity in the market. And here I am, and I don't have a lot of extra cash. I'm kind of rebuilding myself after, uh, you know, essentially breaking even on that property. I had borrowed money from my parents. I needed to pay them back. I paid them back very quickly, luckily. And so, we were able to jump back into the market, which was still ended up being absolutely great timing. But it was hard to see it when I was in it at that time. Ended up being able to jump into the market at the very beginning of 2012, which was
Okay.
ended up being actually a great time to buy. And so, yeah, I have, I just, I always, to me, I think real estate is such a great investment. It's a long game. So I've always got my eye on things. So yeah, we've continued to purchase investment properties. It's been a slow road for me. And I would like to ramp that up as time goes on. But we've got our little carriage house. We have another condo that we rent out. We ended up selling one of our investment properties. I think we ended up selling that. I think in 2013 or 14 for tax purposes.
Hmm.
And I'm now looking at purchasing another property, and I'm actually looking at the Pittsburgh area,
Okay.
which is where my husband is from.
Other than your husband being
Yeah.
from there, what does that market analysis look like for you to determine this is where I want to buy next?
Yeah, yeah. So I've actually been watching Pittsburgh for quite some time. So, my in-laws, of course, they would love us to be back in the Pennsylvania area. And so for years they've been sending, articles about like how great Pittsburgh is, how it's changing, how it's growing. And I really have been watching that, and I feel like the city planners in Pittsburgh have been really doing a great job to bring this city that was so depressed for a little while, after the steel mills were gone and things like that, to bring that economy back up. And they have a very strong medical and hospital economy, and they have a lot of tech there as well. And I took some time to visit Pittsburgh, on our it was earlier this year, just a couple of months ago. And Pittsburgh really reminds me of Denver, like 20 years ago. And so I feel like this is one of the markets where it has been quite depressed. Things are starting to come up. It's a different market than Denver in that it hasn't had like the extreme ups that Denver has had, and appreciation doesn't happen so fast.
Hmm.
Pittsburgh itself has had some pretty steady appreciation, but not super fast appreciation. The areas around Pittsburgh, just they stay the same, like for years and years and years and years. Uh, so it's something to be aware of, but I just feel like there's a lot of potential in that market. Um, Pittsburgh is one of those places that they are looking at as a possible climate refugee as well for climate change. The short term, they do have some level of short term rental regulation there, and I'm of, the unpopular opinion that I really like it when there's some level of short term rental regulation because it prevents saturation in the market, and
Hmm.
it also prevents poor players in the market. So I do like to see some regulation. I think there's some room for stricter regulation in that market, and there probably will be some coming down the line. So as I'm looking at the Pittsburgh market, I'm looking for a property that makes a great short-term rental, but because they have all of that medical there, I'm also looking at a property that, should I need to change it to a 30-day rental, is a great 30-day rental. And not every property makes a great 30-day rental, and not every um, medical traveler or is a travel nurse. I think that's just a big misconception. There are many people who travel in the medical industry for lots of other reasons than travel nursing. And the travel nurses are wonderful guests, but they do tend to be on a budget. And so, my goal is to make sure that my property is a great property for some of those higher end medical travelers. And I find that, 30-day properties are not great if you have like a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house. You want a 1 or 2 bedroom property
Hmm.
that's made for 1 or 2 people. And it has to be in a great location in order for it to work as a 30-day property.
Interesting. That's
Yeah.
very interesting. Going back to having a plan B, and this
Mhm.
is almost like having your plan A, your plan B, or your plan C, or your plan D. Like whatever goes wrong, like I can go to the next, right? If short term rentals doesn't happen, you can do medical travel. If medical travel doesn't happen, you can do mid stays. If mid stays doesn't happen, you can do long term rentals. So I
Yeah.
think that's great advice. Now, in terms of jumping in and buying something with everything you know now, are you still looking at buying in, let's say, one single family property at a time, or have you thought of also going into multifamily and then converting
Yeah.
into short-term rentals, well, mid-term rentals, whatever the case may be? What is it that you're looking at?
Yeah.
Because you
Yeah.
said you want to ramp up your growth, and one single family property at a time, it's going to take some
Yeah.
time there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. No, I'm actually, I've got my eye on. I would love to get a multi-unit property, something with 5, 6, 8 units or something along those lines. I think that would just be a great investment in the Pittsburgh area because, you know, with the multi-unit, you're probably looking at 1 or 2 bedrooms there. While I'm able to do it, and I do, I fully expect that in some point in time that I won't be able to short-term rent whatever I purchase. But while I'm able to short term rent, they also make great short term rentals. 1 and 2 bedroom properties do tend to stay occupied really
Hmm.
well. But they also tend to be a more peaceful short term rental. 1 or 2 people aren't coming in to have a party. They aren't coming in to cause a ruckus. You know,
Sure.
uh, uh, there's a lot of value in these huge properties that sleep 10, 12 people. They can be super, super profitable. but they are not necessarily your most peaceful property to own. It's a very, very active management. And I do plan to hire a property manager in Pittsburgh. I think very much that there's a place where it makes sense to self-manage, and
Hmm.
there's a place where it makes sense not to self-manage, and I just don't have the network and the team in the Pittsburgh area, but I do have a great property manager that I know, and I do have a great real estate agent, and so that's where I'll start.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, two last topics I want to cover is financing and exit strategies, because when it comes to financing short-term rental properties, it's a challenge because the institutions don't consider
Yeah.
the forecasted revenues,
Yeah.
so you end up having to base yourself on the traditional revenues, and that's talking commercial. Talking single family, you're looking at comps,
Right.
and that's it.
Yeah.
So how are you looking at financing, let's say, for this next property of yours, that you're looking at 6 to 8 unit
Yeah.
multi-residential there? How are you looking at financing, and how are you looking at your exit strategy as well? Because it ties together. I think it's a question that goes together, in the sense that, if you look at traditional multifamily, what a lot of people are doing with the forced appreciation is they're coming in, they're increasing rent, and then they're refinancing and pulling out some cash to go and do their next acquisition. and
Yeah.
and yes, it ends up, they end up taking on a lot of leverage,
Yeah.
which is risky, but at least it gives them a path to scale their portfolio. Otherwise, with short-term rentals, we're not there yet as far as being able to sell or refinance
Yeah.
based on cap rates. So how are you thinking of financing, and how are you thinking of leveraging your growth with an exit strategy afterwards?
Yeah. Yeah. So for me, I think having just been in the middle of that 2008, and watching what being over leveraged and how that affected people. I think I'm probably more conservative than most investors out there. With this next property, I'm planning on going, for a more traditional commercial conventional type loan, but there's definitely other options out there. You've got the debt service coverage ratio loans, which are much easier to get. I think luckily I'm in a position where I have the choice between the two, and I'll probably go the other route because the interest rate is a little bit better. Um, you know, my plan is, I think the thing that you always have to realize that a real estate investor is that, you know, you leverage yourself. You want to buy the next property to make more money, but at some point in time, that money does have to be paid back.
Hmm.
Uh, and so, my plan is to use cash flows from, this property and my other investment properties to save for a down payment. Uh, and then, then I might use a little bit of leverage as well, of course, with the equity in the property to buy the next one. But, for me, I say that real estate investing is a marathon. You're in it for the long game. And if you think of it in that way, like you'll have long term and sustainable success.
Hmm.
Whereas, I think it can be easy to be really impatient and say, oh, I've got to ramp up. I'm going to buy 50 properties. I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to have a ton of cash flow. Um, and that's great. If that's your personality and you're the person who wants to do that, I mean, kudos to you. But I'm a little bit more of I think I'm a slow and steady wins the race type person.
That's very, very good advice. And how much leverage is too much leverage? Because I mean, it's kind of like not very clear to me. When you're looking at doing that next acquisition, you said in what you said right now is that you would use the cash flow, and you would maybe leverage just a little bit your
Yeah.
your next acquisition. How do you know? How do you come down to a conclusion of how much leverage you are personally comfortable with taking?
Yeah, and I do think that is a very personal decision, for
Yes.
people, and depending on your risk tolerance uh, but for me, I feel like I think having at least 20% equity, just holding that 20% is great, you
Hmm.
know. And there are a lot of different investment vehicles and things like that that can be leveraged, that people can use. Life insurance is one of them that we're looking into using. It's something that we started planning with our financial planner many years ago, and so we're getting to the point where we can utilize some of the funds that are available through that. Some people like to invest through their 401ks, their Roth IRAs, things like that. So there's a lot of I think there's a lot of value to really setting an intention and working with experts to help you plan and um, making some strategic moves as you go along.
That's awesome. Well, listen, Sabrina, I could take you, I could hold you here for hours because this has been a great conversation. Very, very insightful. I really appreciate you taking the time. For anyone out there that wants to stay connected and follow you, what would be the best place for them to do so?
Yeah, I would say, Instagram is where I'm really building a following. So at Sabrina Knows Airbnb is my Instagram handle. Of course, our website, bnbexcellent.com also, and that's excellent with the T, is a great place to connect.
Amazing, amazing, Sabrina. Well, I really look forward to seeing, what's next for you, and to hopefully have you on the show a couple of months from now, so you can tell us more about where you're at. Really, really appreciate your time. This has been super insightful, and I hope it has been for all of our audience. So, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thank you so much. It's been my pleasure.